Let's look now at support for democracy in East Asia, and this is for the period 2010 to 2012, which represents the third round, or to use a familiar term, third wave of surveys of public opinion within East Asia over the last 15 years. Now I want to look at four dimensions of public opinion. The first, again, which is the blue line, is measuring public support for democracy with the familiar question, is democracy always preferable? The second item, which is the red line here, is this. Do you think that democracy is capable of solving the problems of our country? Sometimes we call that system efficacy. The third item is part of a battery of three questions that we ask respondents in many of these surveys around the world. And this derives from the work of Richard Rose, William Mishler, and Christian Harpfer, who wrote a very influential book in the late 1990s called Democracy and Its Alternatives. They advance what they called the Churchillian thesis of democratic support and legitimacy. That, as Churchill said, democracy is the worst form of government ever invented by man, except for all those other forms that have been tried from time to time. In other words, democracy may be disappointing. It may not be the most elevating, pretty, and clean form of government that one could, in theory, imagine. But when you look at reality as to how other forms of government in specific countries have functioned and how they've abused individual rights and led to various forms of social injustice, then democracy looks, by comparison, to be the best form of government, always preferable. The great, brilliant innovation of Rose, Mishler, and Harpfer was to develop a new means for measuring this Churchillian thesis of democracy. And they do it indirectly by giving people three alternatives. They say, well, there are many forms of government that have been tried from time to time in the world. I'd like to ask you about some options. What if the Parliament were to be shut down and power would be given to a strong leader who would be able to make laws and not have to bother with Parliament? Would you support that? The second option is, well, what if we were to say that only one political party would be allowed to compete in the country? Would you support that? And the third option is, well, what about having the military come back to power? How would you feel about that? So here we look at one of these three options, having a strong man, an autocrat, come into power who'd be able to rule and make laws without having to bother with Parliament. So that's our third item, the percentage that reject having a strong man or an autocrat rule the country. And the fourth item is now the familiar measure, satisfaction with the way democracy is working in the country. And here we see in 5 democracies in East Asia, Korea and Taiwan, which are the most developed and by many measures the most consolidated, and now 2 of the oldest ones within the third wave, with Korea dating back to the December 1987 presidential elections, and Taiwan to the late 80s and finishing its democratic transition with direct presidential elections in 1996. And then the Philippines, which made its transition to democracy in 1986, but has gone through some very difficult and traumatic periods. And Indonesia, which became a democracy with the fall of Suharto after the East Asian financial crisis in 1997, and Mongolia, which made a transition to democracy after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Now, if we look first at the item democracy is always preferable, we see generally middling levels. A level in Korea of 66% that is not as high as one would expect from a democracy that by many measures seems very stable, and rather low, frankly, shockingly low in Taiwan, only about 50%, 55% in the Philippines, and in the 50s or near it in the other two countries. But if you look at other measures, you see quite considerable variation. And this is why when we're trying to measure the legitimacy of democracy and the consolidation of democracy, it's actually very useful to have multiple measures of public support for and commitment to democracy, because a particular measure may resonate with the public in a particular country in a very different way than something that sounds fairly similar. So we see, first of all, in most of these cases, 4 of the 5, that significantly more people say democracy is capable of solving the problems of our country than say democracy is always preferable. Then if you look at the percentage who reject the idea of closing down Parliament and just giving power to one strong autocrat, this is a very, very revealing measure of support for democracy. 80% in Korea and Taiwan reject that option. Only 64% in the Philippines, only 43% in Mongolia. And that's a warning sign. When there are low levels of rejection of authoritarian options, it's a warning sign that democracy may be vulnerable to erosion, if not breakdown. And we see as well that in Korea and Taiwan, there may be some ambivalence about democracy as a general principle, but very healthy levels of the public, 60% in Korea, 69% in Taiwan, when these surveys were done in the 2010 to 2012 period, say that democracy is meeting their expectations more or less. That's only true with 45% of the public in the Philippines and 48% in Mongolia. So what you look at and how you pose a question can be very important in shaping our understanding of public support for democracy.